This project all started with a helpful suggestion from my friends over at the OneFinity team. They sent me a package, and in the package there was a letter that suggested doing a wood brain, a real life wood brain on the CNC, which got me to thinking, well, how am I gonna display the wood brain? Am I gonna put it on a stand? Should I make an actual cradle for it? And then I thought, why not make an epoxy skull that would house the wood brain? And that's where the project came to life. Before I could even attempt to make a life-size epoxy skull and wood brain, I practiced first on a miniature version. I purchased this skeleton model with a removable cap and jaw off of Amazon, and I knew I wanted to turn this crystal clear, make it out of epoxy to look like this, to house the wood brain. That's where the first challenge started. I had to make a silicone mold of all three of the parts. I had never made a silicone mold before, so it was a lot of trial and error. I started out with dollar store Tupperware. I even tried doing two-part molds with clay. There was a lot of learning that went on, and it was a couple months worth of me making molds and figuring out what worked best. Now that I've figured out what silicone works best and how to make the molds, I made multiple runs of mini skulls. So we're gonna make multiple mini brains to fit inside them, and I'm gonna have a limited run on my website after the video goes live. After multiple failed attempts at mold making and casting, I found that the pressure pot was the secret ingredient to getting perfect castings each time. It takes all the bubbles and all of the stress out of making molds and castings. Here's a great comparison between using the pressure pot and not using the pressure pot when casting. You definitely get a lot of bubbles when you don't use the pressure pot, and you get a completely clear casting when you do. My first round of successful pours and castings weren't coming out crystal clear like I had hoped, and I realized it was because the mold that I had made of the original model was not glossy. So I went back and made a glossy model so that way everything from that point forward came out crystal clear. Okay, I'm gonna start off by disassembling this bottom jaw and then also patching some of these holes with some hot glue just to make it easier when I make the mold. Okay, after multiple mold iterations and experiments, I figured out that giving a thin coat of epoxy to the 3D printed model was my best way to go. I'll get a nice smooth and clear casting by having this model itself be glossy. So I've given this all a thin coat of epoxy. It's fully dried, and after experimenting with different ways of making molds, I figured out what's gonna work best for each one of these pieces. So I'm gonna make some molds real quick, and then we'll get back to pouring epoxy. Okay, I just pulled the molds out of the pressure pot. Looks like they did really good. This one was towards the bottom. There's a couple bubbles towards the top that popped, but I think we're gonna still be okay. Let's pop them out of these molds. Okay, now to get the master mold out of the silicone so that we can make a casting of it with the epoxy. I found it best to make jagged cuts with a really sharp utility knife. That way that the silicone locks itself back together when you go to pour the epoxy in and you don't have any leaks. I also found if you have any really large cracks or areas after using it multiple times, using a hot glue gun to seal off the edges keeps it from leaking out. So let's make some jagged cuts to get the cap out of the silicone, and then we'll seal it back together and pour in some epoxy. Okay, so everything came out of the mold extremely well. I'm also excited because I've tried something different with the top cap. I haven't had any success yet with getting a full pour, but I've been making the mold so that it wants to pour this way. This time I made it so it pours this way, and I feel like we're gonna get a full pour this time, as well as giving that clear coat of epoxy. That really thin coat has made this glossy, which now makes the mold representation also glossy on the inside, and I haven't had that as a success yet. So now when I pour the epoxy in here, it's gonna turn out glossy rather than matte, which is what I've been ultimately going for. So now let's prep these molds, mix up some epoxy, and pour it in, put them back on the pressure pot, and see how they turn out. Okay, I just pulled these guys out of the pressure pot. They're nice and cured, so let's demold them. It's always the getting it out of the eyes and the nostril part. It's kind of hard. Nice looking skull. Oh, beautiful fit. And we still gotta pop that off. Looking good. All right, moving right along, I cut a bunch of walnut strips down on the table saw, and then now we're gonna cut them to size on the chop saw, and then we'll take them to the CNC, and then we'll thin them down to the right thickness, and then we'll start cutting out some more brains. Okay, so once I've CNC'd the two sides of the brains and put it together, this underside still has a lot of wood that needs to be basically hogged out. So I was doing it with the Dremel, but I thought, you know what, why not take the drill bit and drill out some of the areas. That way we'll notch out some of the wood, making it easier to go in and Dremel these little pieces so that it fits inside to the skull. Have to do a little sculpting with the Dremel to make it look a little bit more realistic. The CNC can only cut so far when it's laying flat like this, and when you put the two pieces together, the left and the right lobes, it doesn't give as much dimension. So I'm using the Dremel to kind of sculpt the edges, so that way when it connects together, it has this little divot here, and the front lobe, and then on the sides. So let's get to shaping this brain to look like this brain. So the CNC did most of the part to get the brain to this point. However, in order to get this under part, I'm sure I could have figured out a file to be able to cut it, but I ended up going the route of just dremeling it out. And then I gave a little bit of detailing just to match the top section. It's not, you know, it's not as good as the CNC is, but I'm happy with it. And ultimately, this is what we're going for to fit inside of the skull. Now let's oil finish these. It's time to give all of these nice wood brains an oil finish. I'm gonna use some TotalBoat special brush thinner as my mineral spirits to clean them up first, get any excess residue off of them. And then we're gonna use the good old TotalBoat Wood Honey to seal them up. I noticed that this gave the best sheen out of all the different finishes that I tried out as my samples. So let's clean them up first and then oil finish them. Oh, I'm so happy with how this has turned out. Now that I've figured all the steps to make this, let's make it into a life-size version. Okay, the larger mold definitely needs a little bit more sealing. There's a lot more holes and gaps in between, like the teeth area, where the littler mold didn't have that. So I'm gonna use the glue gun, fill in some areas, and then I've decided I'm gonna just epoxy the teeth area and the top dome. That way those areas are gonna be glossy and everything else will be matte when we make the mold with the silicone. And then when we pour the epoxy, the top section will come out nice and crystal clear, the teeth will come out crystal clear, but the actual skull part itself will have a little bit of a matte finish to it. That's the idea at least, so let's get to sealing up the areas that need to be sealed, these holes and such, with the glue, and then we'll put a light coat of epoxy, let it cure, and then we'll make another rubber mold. Okay, we're doing the large one, and mounting it down. This will be the spout. Fill it, and we'll make a mold of the three different components, using the glue gun to hold it in place while it dries. Once I started using the BBDINO Platinum Silicone, which is a 1-to-1 ratio, my mold making game completely changed. The stuff was super easy to work with. I basically just mixed it together, poured it over my master casting, put it in the pressure pot, let it sit for 4 hours, and then demolded it, and it was just that easy. I wish I had started with this, but it was definitely a learning lesson on all the other mold making prior to using this. This is by far the biggest mold that I've made, and it's hefty. It's pretty heavy, and I'm sure it's gonna be a lot of fun getting this guy demolded. So just like I did all the other ones, let's make precision cuts and get it out. Here we go. Demolding the life-size jaw is really starting to fight me. So I'm trying to kind of recreate the same cuts that I made for the mini one, which seemed to open up really well. So I'm trying to do the same thing. It's just that's a really deep amount that I need to get in there. I have a good stretch on this section, but these ones right here are fighting me. I got to get really deep in there. So glad I practiced on the small ones before getting to the large ones. So the spout for the mold was this cap that I used off of like a little travel size bottle, but it works out perfect because it's just enough space to be able to pour the epoxy in, giving that funnel, and then there's only that little amount that needs to get cut off at the end. I'm using TotalBoat ThickSet, and it's a 3-to-1, so I've made my markings on my measuring cup of how much I'm gonna need. Let's mix up some epoxy, we'll pour it in our molds, then I'll put these back in the pressure pot, and we'll leave them for about 24 hours, and then we'll demold them. Okay, it's time to demold the large mold. Looks like we had a little bit of a leak, but not bad. And it's still quite high at the top, so I think we're gonna be okay. But let's pull it out of the pressure pot and demold it. Oh, I love it. The teeth are super glossy. Yes, just gotta cut that little spout part off. Looking good. All right, now to just make the cap and the jaw. Now that we were able to figure out how to cast a life-size epoxy skull, let's go figure out how to make a wood brain to fit inside it. It took some trial and error, but I finally figured out the right file to make the mini wood brains. I went with walnut just because the contrast is beautiful. Now that I've figured out and pumped out a bunch of the mini wood brains, let's make a life size. I'm gonna have to cut it in multiple pieces. I have some 3/4 inch walnut. Let's mount it down to the CNC and get to cutting out some life size walnut brains. Okay, this is an exciting moment. I finally have a left and a right large brain out of walnut. It took some trying. My buddy Luke from Luke in the Garage helped me out with the file.
Hi.
Hi, this is my buddy Luke.
Hi.
I just ran the left side again. It looks like it worked out. I'm gonna pull it up and we'll assemble it and see how it looks, see if it fits inside the skull. I'm excited, let's get to it. And there is a full life-size wood brain in 6 pieces. Now I gotta figure out, that's right, I need to figure out getting this portion out so there's less of this. So I think with this file I need to have it cut out some, but not bad for a first go around. Okay, so before I glue up the life-size wood brain, I should have probably figured this out with the file of cutting out that center part so that it fits inside the skull just right. But what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna take it over to the scroll saw, cut out this portion right here, and I'm gonna cut out this section right here. That way when they stack up, it'll be voided on the underside, and that way it'll fit nicely inside the epoxy skull. Okay, yeah, so having cut out those little pieces gives me definitely more clearance to now fit it inside of the skull. I'm just doing a little dry fit with some tape. I think it's time we glue this together, give a little bit of some contouring, some sculpting on the back and the front end so that these two meet up kind of nicely. Let's get to it. Okay, I could be happy with that. I did a little carving on the edges, sanded it, have my 2 sides that are glued. Now I need to glue the 2 pieces together and then oil finish this. Ooh, it looks so good, oil finished. Okay, now all that's left is to put it inside of its epoxy skull. Well friends, it took a lot of trial and error to get to this point, but I finally have a life-size walnut wood brain and an epoxy skull to hold it, and a bunch of miniature versions of it. After doing this multiple times, I really figured out what works and what didn't work. The pressure pot was definitely a game changer, using the right type of silicone, and having a good friend like Luke in the Garage to be able to help you out with the file for the CNC. Huge thank you to the OneFinity team for sending me the package and the letter that inspired this video, and huge thank you to BBDINO for sending me their platinum silicone, which ultimately was a game changer for making the molds. I hope you enjoyed this video, friends, and until next time.